I would make a rough guess and say that at least 80% of the people watching this video would know exactly what kind of sword this is in front of them. This is my reproduction Pompeii Gladius. I got this when I was 15 years old and didn't know any better. Taking it outside and swinging it at apples and plastic drink bottles, you never really, got the sense that you were in Gaul fighting the Celts, but regardless, you understand that this was my first piece of history which got me involved in learning about the Roman Empire in general. You see, back then it was all about the Principate era legionaries, Larica segmentata with, the rectangular scutum, the stereotypical Augustan legions. Indeed, I didn't actually distinguish Augustan legions from, say, Caesar's legions, who, mainly wore loca hamata and had the different helmets. So it's a very much entry-level way of understanding the topic that you're interested in. Now, I named this channel Magister Militum for a very crucial reason. One area which I've always been fascinated in with the Roman Empire is indeed its fall, at least in the West, ranging from the crisis of the 3rd century to the eventual date of 476 with the deposition of Romulus Augustus, the final Roman emperor in the West, at least what is considered by most people. There is also, of course, Nepos, but that is a much different topic for a much later time. At least to me, it made sense to do the first video on the Gladius because this is the weapon that is used at the beginning of the time period that I wish to research, which is the fall of the Western Roman Empire between the end of the crisis of the 3rd century and the eventual date of 476 AD. Now, what is interesting is this sword gets superseded by one that is, to be quite honest, a few 100 millimeters longer. And I indeed have a Sparta on the way as we speak. So a video will be done about that soon, but I wanted to go over the Gladius, and it is well overdone. Every YouTuber has a Gladius, but I think it would be still good to go over some aspects. Now, this weapon was used by the Roman Republic and the later Roman Empire for a solid 600 years. 600 years of use. They average around 1 kilogram in weight, and their blades can vary from being 450 millimeters to being 680 millimeters long. That would be 18 to 27 inches. That is quite a lot of deviation. They're generally 5 to 7 centimeters wide, or 2 to 2.8 inches. They are usually steel, always double-edged, and the hilts are made of wood, bone, or bronze. These are very interesting swords because they vary greatly. There was a degree of standardization, but there are multiple variants which we will get onto in a minute. Indeed, my version, the Pompeii Gladius, has a blade just shy of 500 millimeters, approximately 497 millimeters long, and it is around the 50 millimeter wide mark, which is very middle of the road when it comes to its size. Gladius in Latin, as we all know, simply means sword. This, to me, is the ancient equivalent of us saying that anything a soldier carries that is a weapon is a gun. We probably don't know what the exact term used by the soldiers. Perhaps they had different names for the patterns. I haven't done that level of research, so I couldn't hypothesize on that. I would think that the Romans would have their own terminology for their weapons. For example, the army does not call, at least in Australia, we don't just call the gun a gun, we call it an Ostire or an F90 Steyr, for example. We have distinguishing elements. Otherwise it would be very confusing because a gun can range from the Browning High Power to the, the Ostire or the FN Minimi. It would be very confusing if they just called them all Gladius. But Gladius, plural Gladii, that is the Roman term for sword. This was originally adopted by the Republican legions during the conquest of Hispania in the 3rd century BC. This was believed to have been used by Celtic Iberian soldiers. The Latin soldiers of the Roman Republic, you know, while they were fighting against, I believe this was the Punic Wars, they were fighting against sort of mercenaries hired by the Carthaginians, and yeah, they came across this sword and they were like, geez, this thing is super effective, we need to use this thing. So they've eventually adopted something that is useful. We've seen the Romans do this countless times before, the adoption of mail from the Celts, the scutum shield, and now this. So they take something that they like and they adopt it. You'll see this later on with the Spatha. Once I eventually get one, we can open up that whole can of worms in another time. So obviously the Romans adopt the sword and they start calling it the Gladius Hispaniensis. Of course, you got to remember that, especially in upper class society, the Romans were bilingual, so they would speak both Greek and Latin. In Greek, this is called an abirike machaika, I believe. That's how you say it. I don't really know Greek to the minimalist extent that I understand Latin. I know nothing of Greek, so if I've butchered the pronunciation, I'll put the word up on screen, so if you know how to pronounce it properly, we'll just go on from there. So yeah, often these swords were put in scabbards that were secured on the soldier's belt. Now, these would be attached by rings with straps, and it is speculated that the soldiers would wear these on the right side. Now, you could think of many reasons why they draw it on the right side. Some people would say that due to the way you'd hold the scutum, it would be hard to draw it from the left side. Some people say that because all the Romans are fighting in close order formations, you draw it from the right because there is less risk of cutting the person to your left if you just draw the sword on the right, and this person to your right will have their scutum to the left. Many reasons for that, but I personally believe that they did wear the gladius on the right side if you were a standard legionary. If you were an officer, you would wear your gladius on the left side as a mark of distinction. The other way you could carry them is, of course, with the leather strap going over your shoulder and it being secured to your side by a belt. The other thing really to note is that the hilt section is called the capulus, and yeah, this one is supposed to be an imitation of bone, and then with the wooden pommel and sort of grip guard, I would call that. Not really a cross guard, just the sort of thing that stops your hand from flying forward. So, as I mentioned before, there were multiple variants of the gladius. The original one that came in was the gladiensis, and this one was the largest and heaviest of the gladiuses, and gladii I should say. These had a very pronounced leaf-shaped blade that was profile tapered at the waist. Indeed, I'll have a guide for you on the screen, so the one that is obviously says Gladius Hispaniensis. Yeah, so I'm guessing these were the first ones to be introduced. These were used up until about 20 BC, I believe. So they didn't last too long for some reason. I guess the Romans sort of preferred their way of using them, so their sort of leaf blade, which I'm guessing would be better for cutting wood, have been discarded in favour of something more direct, literally, for the thrusting of the weapon. The Mainz Gladius was likely the most common gladius used by the frontier legions on the borders. These are characterized by the slight tapering at the waist, followed by a very pronounced tip. Now, the one in front of you that you can see on camera, this one is a Pompeii Gladius. The example shown. Now, this thing, keep in mind I have not taken very good care of the blade because I was ignorant as a child. This thing has straight parallel edges, and then at the end we have a triangular tip. Now, it is called the Pompeii Gladius because these were excavated at the ruins of Pompeii. It is believed that these were less battle-effective versions of the gladius. Indeed, they are apparently the shortest. These are also often confused for Sparta, which is really funny considering these are also the shortest of the gladii, so whatever. The last one of note is the Mainz Fulham Gladius. So the Mainz Fulham Gladius is considered a sort of in-between between the Mainz Gladius and the Pompeii Gladius. Some people think that they are evolved from the Mons Gladius, but I don't really know too much about them. Now, I won't really go on much further about the Gladius from here, aside from how they were used, because I feel that the majority of YouTubers would already have spoken about the Gladius. If you were interested in any kind of Roman sword, you were interested in the Gladius. So there's probably a million different topics and discussions about how Gladius was used and all that. Suffice to say, I've only got one input on that, which is these are optimized for thrusting. In close order formation, it is definitely better to thrust at your opponent than to expose yourself by sort of swiping your arm over the shield, or moving your shield to the side to swipe at someone. It's just better to thrust. You can hide the point behind your large scutum, and then you can just sort of bring it over, bring it to the side. It's unpredictable. They don't know where your sword would be coming from. The only thing is, though, the instruction given that the Gladius can only be used to thrust. Indeed, I've cut many things with the Gladius. I haven't actually stabbed that many things with this. You could cut with Gladius, but it was optimized for thrusting, the same way that a handgun was optimized for use with two hands, but you can shoot it with one. An interesting thing I decided to do, since I have a Spather on the way, is actually get a paper template and figure out how long my Spather would be compared to my Gladius. So they look very similar to each other, and if I just bring it back to, bam, that point right there, that is how much extra length I'm getting from my new Spather, approximately. Whether or not it's actually that length, we'll have to see. Now, I find this very interesting because the terminology means that a Spather is usually going to be longer than the Gladius, but there are some Gladii which are, 680 millimeters long, if we're talking about the original Gladii. And this is one of the shorter Spather, which is only 650 millimeters long itself. And this is significantly shorter than the Migration era swords. The shorter length, the shorter end of the Migration era swords, they're about here. The longer end, they're back here. These are truly longer swords. These are noticeably longer than the Gladius. Indeed, this is approaching the Viking/arming sword length. So, but mine, right back to here. And I'm satisfied with having both. Indeed, I plan on having a fair collection of Spather. Whether or not I get another Gladius in the future, not too sure. But my sort of focus for this channel and my focus of the period won't really be talking about the Gladius too much, unfortunately. So if you enjoyed this content, let me know. I haven't really structured the video in any major way. It's fairly rudimentary. Indeed, the audio would be fairly strained because I don't have hundreds of dollars worth of camera equipment and audio equipment. This is just a very simple, basic setup. And if I have to pick between getting that and getting a sword, I think we know what we'd all pick. So yeah, any feedback or even views would be appreciated. But I just hope to provide my insights into all this, because I find this stuff really fascinating, and I could talk about this all day. So yeah, hope you all have enjoyed. I will speak to you all next time.